The next award is the Albert R. and Alma Shadle Fellowship. A single graduate fellowship in mammalogy is provided annually by the Albert R. and Alma Shadle Endowment Fund. The award is made by the Buffalo Foundation at the recommendation of the Grants and Aid Committee of our society. Generally, the award is approximately $4,000, depending on the markets. The fellowship is intended to promote a professional career in mammalogy by allowing the recipient greater freedom to pursue research. Applicants must be enrolled as graduate students in a college or university in the United States for the forthcoming academic year and be engaged in research in any area of mammalogy. And the winner of the 2022 Shadle Fellowship, joining us in style, is Matt Snider.
Hello, everybody. It is really good to see everybody here today. I'm very thankful for the opportunities that the Shadle Award was able to give me in terms of expanding my research and, even more importantly, continuing to build relationships with partners in the field. So the thing that I'd like to focus on for this particular talk is talking about adopting some of these technologies and techniques to make wildlife research in the field at the very the very forward edge, a little bit more accessible for all of our international partners. I'd like to start off by thanking a lot of these international partners, especially places like Kuse in Namibia and the Kasanka Trust in Zambia. They were the local partners that really gave me perspective and focus in terms of how we, as especially American researchers moving into international environments, can help buttress and make more effective the efforts of a lot of these partners. Also for a lot of the governmental organizations like Ministry of Environment and Tourism in Namibia and the Department of National Parks and Wildlife in Zambia for helping facilitate some of this. I also can't forget to mention a lot of the academic partners, both those in other countries like Namibia University of Science and Technology, but also the American side of things where they've provided an immense amount of support, as well as funding bodies like American Society of Mammalogists and National Geographic. So it's been really exciting to be able to see all of the representation that we've had so far at the meeting. If your thumbtack is not represented here, put it up there because it's very exciting seeing this map build. And it's great to follow Monica because I feel like the relationship building that we as mammalogists are really kind of an accelerator for a lot of how conservation can be more effectively done in the field. From my perspective, the dream is to have a lot of these projects in the developing world locally led, locally skilled, and internationally partnered. And as part of this, I feel like there's a lot that we can offer in terms of adoptability for techniques that we are developing, techniques that we are refining, and we can really spin out to the local level where they can have the most impact. And I'm going to use a couple of case studies that have been crucial in my work in Namibia and Zambia to talk about it. And then we'll wrap up at the end by asking, really, how close are these dreams on the horizon? So just as a little bit of background, we're going to be talking about adoptability because a lot of these, as mammalogists, we understand that mammals are disappearing. If you do have questions about that, you should go talk to Dr. Galetta and ask him about defaunation from yesterday. We also know that we need data to make informed management decisions to really help with the conservation decision-making cycle at a management level. So our job as scientists can be, what systems can we bring together to overcome challenges and deliver the data needed for this rapid decision-making cycle? So the way we're going to be talking about adoptability today is, in my framework, I felt like these four things on the left were really the major themes in terms of how quickly we could bring a kind of product to market for our local conservation partners. We talk about hardware, study design, data processing, and statistics. And I kind of grade it on a stoplight scale where green is we're ready to go, we can implement this in the field, our partners are able to utilize it kind of in that single research season. Yellow, we're still working out the kinks a little bit. There's growing to be done, refining to be done. And then the red I found out you need the engineers. You need to bring some of that technique with you, and you can be part of that learning process, but some of the things you need to make this work are beyond most of our skills as ecologists. So let's step right into the first case study, and let's go to the arid savanna in Namibia. Now, Namibia is a really cool place to work because there's state-managed, communally managed, and privately managed conservation areas. And depending on how you categorize it, it's between 25 and 45% of the country is under conservation management, which makes for some pretty unique study sites, but it also means that your local partners can give you different perspectives on the local needs of those organizations and the people around them that both face the benefits of having wildlife in their backyard, but also the risks. So the place that we were partnered with in Namibia is called Ankuse Foundation, and it's on Ankuse Wildlife Sanctuary, just a little bit east of Windhoek. So it was nice to be able to really get to know these partners because the management groups there were able to share some of their management goals in terms of finding population trends, but they were also able to really help me understand some of the challenges that they face. Things like how their wildlife is adapting to things, or how their wildlife is reacting to things like drought conditions, which unfortunately are likely to spin up with climate change, as well as increasing pressures from things like non-local poaching. So what we were doing here is we were adapting a known technique. Many of you are aware that currently the aerial survey technique is a kind of a Norton-Griffith model from a single engine airplane. You have a pilot, 2 observers, and a recorder. You record all the animals in situ. And we were adopting that to try to figure out if we could replace this model with drones. So one of the chief reasons I felt like it was important to try to use drones in this is for safety. I've had 2 friends die and a number of associates in single-engine aircraft failures in sub-Saharan Africa. And we know that it is a prominent cause of death for wildlife ecologists in the field because maintenance is expensive, expertise is hard to come by. On top of that, we really wanted to look at costs. There's a lot of these techniques that are really advanced that can fundamentally change the way local organizations can collect data, but they're just a little bit out of reach from how these organizations have to put their money. In the case of our drones, our goal is to be able to instead of having a 3 to 5 year wait between aerial surveys, with the battery-based nature of our drones, we can accelerate that to a quarterly or possibly a monthly scale data collection, which can vastly increase the granularity of the data you're delivering to these management bodies. And finally is the accuracy issue. When you're flying in a single-engine airplane at 120 kilometers an hour at your slowest, you really hope that the counter on the left, the counter of the right, are not missing those species, and the species groups that they do see, they're counting the numbers of those group sizes accurately. For our technique with the drones, because we're recording the data and then bringing it back to process, we can actually go through that data at a much more detailed level to try to make sure that we're not missing animals on that landscape. So returning to that adoptability framework, from a hardware perspective, we know that drones are delivering some opportunities, but a lot of people, when they think of drones, they think of these quadcopters. Now, don't get me wrong, we tried using the quadcopters. We had the engineers that came with us, like, tear these things apart. They were able to double their range, untether them from the controls, but it simply couldn't do what our local conservation partners really needed them to do. So we settled on a fixed-wing, 2-engine platform like this. This was able to give us quite a bit of range, a lot of automation in how the drones worked. It really opened up a lot of new paths that we could really adopt those single-engine aircraft patterns of data collection. However, unfortunately, because some of these drone technologies are a little less refined, we did run into some issues sometimes. Hence the engineers needed in terms of grading how that situation went down. From a study design perspective, though, we were out a little bit ahead because what we were looking for is, can we outperform the value for these airplanes? And then, once we were thinking about the quality of the data we're collecting from the drones, we wanted to see if we could develop a detectability measure for pairing the drone data with ground-based data in order to give us a good ground truthing ability to actually find density estimates on the environment. So for study methodology, we came out a little bit ahead, a little bit in the green, because we're adopting a relatively refined methodology with our drones and highly professional ground teams. And then we move forward to conduct a paired set of surveys. This is an example of data we collected from September 27th. You can see the flight path of the drone going back and forth on this landscape in a total count model, where it can observe all of the animals 250 meters north and south of the ground team, which you can now see in black. Now the red detections here are the drone detecting groups of animals, and the blue detections are the ground element conducting distance surveying or distance sampling, observing the groups of animals as well. And you can already tell that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of where some of these ground teams were seeing things versus where our aerial element was seeing things. In this particular case, the aerial element, our drone saw 50 individual animals, and our ground element observed 38. So we already know that there's a little bit of a difference there, but that's how we're going to be working with detectability. So we know that the study's design comes out a little bit easier, but now we go into the data processing. Now, I'm going to be honest, the data processing was a little bit weighty. We basically had undergraduates that I trained up in terms of how to identify animals from aerial pictures like this, and it was an interesting environment. I'm sure all of you highly trained mammalogists can very easily observe all the animals in this picture, and including getting very accurate counts of each one of these. However, as you may or may not expect, even the largest land animal in the world can be difficult to observe under certain conditions. In this case, you've got a couple elephants, and I'm going to be honest, they might be big, but they can be pretty hard to observe on the landscape based on the data we collected, and some of my students missed them, which is why we do a double count. We have 2 students going over the same data so we can do a little bit of comparison, because if you're missing the elephants, it worries me about what else you're missing. We did have a little bit of acceleration from software that previous students developed. ImageWAO helped categorize all of the individuals in all of our pictures, and it meant that all of the pictures were kind of filed in a fast kind of click-through sequence so that you didn't have to spend time kind of organizing things, and it was developed in an evening by one of my engineering students who was really annoyed that I made him open up every individual picture with double clicks. So he wrote a piece of software that could automate that whole process. Engineers are crazy. Coming back to that data processing point though, one of my students, the one on the right, would tell you this experience of counting animals started off feeling like a safari and ended up feeling like child labor, because there was a very large time component involved in counting each of these transects, which was something that we really had to pay attention to. Fortunately, we were able to save kind of some of the bonus of adaptability here for our statistics, where we're looking at trends over time from known statistical techniques based on previous aerial surveying. And then I'm going to be building out that detectability measure to be able to look at it at a species by species level in the coming future. We did run into challenges, I'm going to be honest. Sometimes we'd crash our drone into the ground at 80 kilometers an hour. Sometimes they'd just burst into flame for no reason whatsoever. And then on one occasion, we flew the drone accidentally into an emergency landing in Clarence's enclosure, and we had been flying over his head at 6:45 in the morning for 3 years, and he appeared to have remembered this because he made our drone a bit of a chew toy and left it as a pile of broken dreams and sad ecologist tears. That being said, we were able to collect some really good data. For our paired transects between our ground count and our drone count, we found that in 14 out of 18 cases, the drone was counting more individuals on the landscape in those paired transects than the ground count was. And if you look at it in terms of individual, like by day counts, you found that there was actually a lot of variation in terms of the numbers that were being detected by our ground sampling element and by the drone element. This is something that I'm going to have to delve into pretty seriously, especially when we tease it apart by species level. So here's an example of the animals that were detected in species by species. There were a number of species that we detected on the environment, but once you get to something as small as a steenbuck, it starts to get a little bit more difficult, and there's definitely a threshold where I would say it's kind of a warthog threshold, where things smaller than a warthog, you start I start worrying that we're missing a lot more steenbucks and common dikers on the environment. However, we did find, after talking to our conservation partners, the ones especially interested in high-value animal conservation, that our flights were having a bit of an incidental bonus in this case. Namibia, unfortunately, faces a bit of pressure from syndicated poaching going after rhinos, but when local poaching groups find out that there's Americans flying around with drones, suddenly there's a lot less interest in poaching on that particular property, which helped our conservation partners. So looking at current improvements, knowing that the data processing was a little bit of a slowdown for us, we actually had a student develop a single-shot detector mechanism for machine learning this past spring, and I'm an ecologist, I assume this is what it looks like. But basically, he developed an algorithm that meant that instead of it taking 150 people hours to process the data, he was able to build that machine learning algorithm so that it trains using our data on a 10-hour cycle on our university cluster, and then he can process an entire season's worth of data in 1 hour, automated, with him eating danishes. I don't know what engineers do. Which means that this spun out to our local conservation partners, means that the manpower or the people hours that are required for processing our data, or for processing the data on the landscape, can mean that they can actually automate a lot of these processes to be able to get good quality data with minimal human investment to be able to turn around those decision-making cycles quite rapidly. So we've covered the arid savanna, looking at the drone component. But what about technology that is a little bit more ubiquitous to us, a little bit easier on kind of the wallet and the budgets and that kind of thing? Let's reroute a little bit and look at the adoptability paradigm when it comes to blending different data sets in Zambia. So in this case, I was working with the Kasanka Trust on Kasanka National Park. This was really good because this is the first time I was working closely with both the management bodies and some independent anti-poaching groups that were national, like kind of federal organizations as well. Now, this proved to be a really interesting spot because I normally work in spaces like the arid savanna where there's relatively open landscapes and things like that. But in this case, I got to work in this Miambo forest and floodplain area in Kasanka National Park, which you can see here, and deploy cameras in a lot of these beautiful environments that I had not really understood some of their conservation challenges before. There's two main habitat types. There's the floodplains, which you can see on the left, and there's this Miambo forest that you can see on the right. And talking with the conservation managers, I came to understand that there's definitely focal species that add more value to the park because they drive a lot of tourism. Tourism as an income generator here was really important for them. Things like waterbuck, things like sable antelope, but they're also facing some acute pressure in some of their wildlife resources because there's been an uptick in commercial poaching that is outtaking some of this bushmeat in order to feed kind of a luxury market in places like Lusaka, the capital, where people can afford to pay for luxury bushmeat kind of as a status symbol. And in this case, there ended up being a higher density of snares in Kasanka National Park than I've personally experienced in any of the African conservation spaces I've worked in so far. You could see it in our camera traps. We had a lot of detections of different mammals that were that could potentially be brought down for bushmeat, but we also saw it in non-target species like this elephant. If you look closely, this elephant has a pretty severe and permanent wound in its trunk as a result of the snaring environment here. So it was something that our conservation partners, the Kasanka Trust, really wanted to work on as a particular challenge. So looking at it from a hardware perspective, we've used camera traps for quite some time. All of the scouts and rangers at Kasanka National Park picked it up lickety-split. Salifia, the woman programming the camera trap right here, is now in charge of the camera trap array at Kasanka National Park. She can program all of that stuff. She knows how to set out different sampling regimes and that kind of thing. And it has really shown that there's so much enthusiasm for bringing these tools online if we can just focus on the capacity building as partner organizations. So the hardware, we've been able to bring that on board pretty quickly. People learn the resource or learn the technique very easily. It's widespread. It's a little bit cheaper. So we deployed these camera traps in a bit of a stratified design across the environment, where we tried to have half in these Miambo landscapes, the woodlands, and half in the grasslands. Now pay attention to this map, there will be questions later. Also, integrating the data from the management, they had GPS tracking with all of their anti-poaching patrols for the previous year, which is a boon of a data set for me, because now I could compare what was going on in these spaces depending on what the anti-poaching patrol density was. And it helped them because it helped them, they wanted an idea of how to see value or refine their anti-poaching patrol patterns. Now, there were some challenges here. You may have noticed on that other map that there were some blank spaces in Kasaka National Park where there were suspiciously no cameras. That picture was that picture had all of my successfully deployed camera sites. Unfortunately, there were a number of cameras that were stolen. They would cut them off, the poachers would cut them off the trees. Sometimes they would just get melted into oblivion by poachers set fires in order to clear certain landscape blocks and force wildlife into certain zones on the park. But fortunately, we were able to collect a lot of data, and we ended up using Wildlife Insights as our data processing tool. For those of you unfamiliar, this has been a bit of a boon to ecologists because it helps you get rid of all of those pictures of grass gently blowing in the wind that haunt us camera trappers, and it helps you organize all of these sequences into what species we're seeing and group sizes and things like that. It does make the data processing quite a bit more efficient. However, it still took almost 640 people hours to process this 6 months of data, which if you're a local conservation group working on the ground, that's a cost prohibitive amount of people hours in order for you to get the data that you need. We will be working a little bit, I will be working further on community-based hierarchical occupancy models. It's a bit of my upcoming work, and that is something that I certainly don't know enough to teach, but it is something that would be really good to spin out to these local organizations. Now, this is a quick view of what we found. As you can see here, there's a bit of a difference in terms of species that were represented. The puku, in terms of just raw detections, kind of blew everybody else out of the water. But when you dove into it a little bit further by environment, you saw that puku were only dominant in the grasslands area. There was actually a little bit more diversity when you look at some of those common woodland herbivores. Now, those who are keen-eyed on that last picture of the graph would be able to see that there's actually pretty low representation in terms of species numbers, or in terms of the raw detection levels for some of these carnivore species. And when you slice that up a bit, you actually see that in both of these environments, domestic dog appears in the top 3 predators in this environment. And it's not because domestic dog are accidentally walking into Kasaka National Park. It's because they're used as tools by some of those commercial poaching assets. And in cases where they get separated from their poaching group, they're actually serving as carnivores in this environment. So when we actually added the data from the anti-poaching patrols, we saw that there was a difference in terms of patrol density and average raw detection rate, where the grasslands showed that in the areas that had the highest levels of anti-poaching effort, we actually saw a much higher raw detection rate in those habitats. However, in the spaces like the Miambo forest, we actually didn't see that much, we didn't see a difference between the areas that had heavy anti-poaching presence and the areas that had no anti-poaching presence. And you could see this in some of the target animals as well. In the grasslands, the puku were clearly hanging out in areas that had that high level of anti-poaching kind of zone of protection. And the same was true for one of the other target species by poachers, but also a value species for the local management with the bushbuck. You also saw it in non-poaching targeted species like elephants, where if you're this male and you've had a bad experience with snare traps, I could see that possibly modifying some of your behavior, where you might go to the areas that had less of that poaching presence and had more of those anti-poaching patrols. Now, in some cases, there were species like the sable antelope where they didn't appear very often in the anti-poaching patrol dense areas, but they also didn't appear often in the poaching patrol areas. So there is a little drilling that I'll have to do in terms of why some of these species were choosing one way or the other. Now, an incidental bonus we had in this case was that we were able to help the prosecution rates for our local partners to be able to find these constant repeat commercial poachers who are selling their meat in the capital and be able to really help with their prosecution, because a lot of these poachers were just showing up on our cameras and they'd go to court and say, oh, I accidentally wandered into the park one time. And then my local partners would be like, wow, we saw you on the 28th, the 3rd, the 4th, the 18th. And they'd be able to help with the prosecution process quite a bit. Now, coming back to that data processing, this is going to be an improvement that really helps some of our local partners. Kasanka Trust is a kind of a lean, mean, high delivery conservation organization. And in the case of Wildlife Insights, they're now delivering this AI-assisted search pattern for detecting or identifying your animals, where it's actually making it so that it's weeding out a lot of, it's anticipating which animals are in frame, and it's making it so that you as a trained mammalogist would basically confirm. So it's taken it from 2 minutes, or 2 sequences a minute to 10 sequences a minute. And it's also helping performance on the statistical point of view, where you're looking at being able to access in Wildlife Insights a lot of automated calculations for things like species richness, occupancy model, and detection rates. So how close is the horizon? Let's wrap this up. The future looks bright across these thresholds. We can see from our drone development that the cost of drones is going down, but also the skill threshold for how Namibians are being able to use drones is going up. Camera traps, we're already good there. We've been able to blend these study design techniques, both by adapting old data and by utilizing data that local organizations are already collecting. And the future actually looks bright for data processing, because AI is accelerating the data processing potential for both aerial and camera trap mechanisms. And the statistics is something that we're continuing to be able to use, but they are techniques that we have established in the past. As we go forward, it's exciting to see these Namibian partners, students at Namibia University of Science and Technology, become more familiar with these drones. They are the future drone operators in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're already seeing adoption by other potential partners. This is Dr. David Kamiti, the Director of Research at the Grevi Zebra Trust, and they're already starting to use drones to monitor the vegetation and wildlife rates in drought-resistant areas. The management at Kasanka Trust has been able to adopt some of their patrol patterns and their deployment mechanisms so that they can look to increase their zone of protection to other areas of high species richness. And the goal here, remember, is to be locally led, locally skilled, and internationally partnered. So I want to say asante, nakuteta, zikomo, gangantz, and thank you. And I'd love to take questions.
Questions? I'm going to see in the back there. Yes.
So here in the States, I know for a lot of drones, they require licenses to actually operate them. Is that something that your partners have to contend with? And if so, how accessible is getting through that process?
Great question. So that depends on kind of country by country. There are some countries, unfortunately, like Zambia and to a lesser extent Kenya, that have really tight restrictions, and other countries like Namibia that have much more open access to things like drone. It's actually one of the reasons I think the Namibian partner students we have are some of the fastest growing skill base, because they're able to practice a lot of these skill sets relatively easily compared to, say, a Zambian or a Kenyan contemporary, for sure. So it's country by country, similar to how they run their conservation systems. Good question.
Brett, please.
I can imagine something of an arms race wherein the poachers will soon learn how dangerous the camera traps are, learn how to detect them, and learn how to take them out.
Yes.
How do you respond to that?
Unfortunately, within the study cycle that I had, we did lose a number of cameras. I think we had 9 cameras destroyed, stolen, thrown in the river kind of deal. So yes, as things like prosecution evidence shows up, there's definitely a trend where poachers might be worried about these on the environment, but it's also come to a position where we as deployment teams were actually stumbling upon poaching groups in some of these wide-flung areas, and it's kind of created a little bit more of a landscape of fear environment where poachers now see cameras and they're like, oh, somebody came out here to put this out, somebody's coming out here to pick it up, and we don't know exactly when or where these are occurring. So it looks like it's actually, the more cameras we're putting out, the more the poachers realize, oh, this is definitely not a patrol empty landscape kind of thing. So it's a bit of a tug of war in that respect. Yeah, good question though.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah. Find me later.
Yes.